So I had wanted to continue today with anti-Semitism, but then I realized that really we need to talk about nationalism first. So let's do that. Nationalism is one of those ideas where I said earlier, they're normal under certain social conditions, and they're radicalized by fascism. So what is nationalism and where does it come from? Because the scare quotes around the normal here, of course, suggests that maybe it isn't as normal as it appears to be, since it is part of what, the kinds of ideas that never are questioned, which is suspicious. For historians, one of the most foundational works on the critique of nationalism would be Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, where he says that this is, in fact, a concept and a way of thinking about your identity, your place in the world, your political goals that is of very recent vintage. And that is empirically true. And I mean, part of what makes nationalism hide its origins and cover its traces is that it involves this myth-making, these myths of origin that say, this nation has always lived here, these people have always shared this spirit, this is our land, and this has been the case since time immemorial. When in reality, the nation as we find it today was invented at most in the 19th century. So we can't take it for granted. We have to consider it as a historical artifact in its own right. In other words, if we say, well, the people liked Hitler because he was advocating for the nation and the greatness of the nation, that is not an explanation. That is something that in itself begs an explanation. You can't take nationalism for granted uncritically. Because not everybody was thinking in these nationalist terms, after all. Later on, the communists said, we made a mistake in not addressing that, although there are two prongs to that. One is to say that we didn't counter this enough, and the other is to say that we didn't take this on board enough, which obviously is, you can't do both at the same time. So before you get nationalism, you have nation states, which makes it a little bit, or you have the territorial monarchies that become the containers for future classical nation states. So this makes it a little more confusing because people will say, but Spain and England and France have been around for so long. How can you say nationalism is a thing of the 19th century? Well, just that you have territorial states doesn't mean that you have a nation, and it doesn't mean that you have nationalism. So in these places, you have fights within the high medieval power structure, the feudal power structure, where the central authority eventually manages to lay claim of supremacy over all the lesser nobles. In France, this is mainly a result of the 100 Years' War. In England, it is the War of the Roses that puts the Tudors in place. In Spain, it is the War of the Communities, which consolidates the Spanish monarchy after the unification of Aragon and Castile. So here, then, you have a precursor, perhaps, where you have something that transcends local identities and where there is a requirement to be paying tribute and homage to the king, and not just to your local lord, to the King of Spain, and not just to the Catholic Church. And of course, that in the English case, that soon becomes completely separated from Catholicism too, whereas France and Spain remain rooted, like their royal claims to power remain rooted in being Catholic. In England, it's the exact opposite. So the way in which power is consolidated in these states. It's a costly affair to raise the armies, to lay down the law against local lords who would rather be doing their own thing. The way that these monarchies usually accomplish that is by aligning themselves with the rising bourgeoisie, with the citizens of independent towns who have a source of revenue through manufacturing and trade that is distinct from the main economic base, which is landed property. On that landed property rests the power of the nobles. If you want to break that, then another social source of power that you have, economic power, is of course the city. So in all these cases, it usually is a way for kings to raise their revenue by aligning themselves with cities, often by giving them some more local control, especially vis-a-vis the nobles than they had previously enjoyed. So if you read Adam Smith, there is Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. There is a study in there where he describes how the English kings established themselves with the help of cities in exchange for making the cities liable for taxes and duties only to the king himself, and then they would get to have self-government in the way that they chose to fulfill that duty. So they give a lump sum to the king, but it is up to the city council to decide how these taxes are going to be levied. These projects of territorial consolidation are, of course, attempted everywhere around the time of the early modern and late Renaissance period. And in some places they work out. In England, which is my last example here, it's kind of not settled after the War of the Roses. It continues to be, and especially because of the question of faith, it continues to be a rocky process. So at first, you get a Protestant bourgeois attempt to consolidate territorial state power in the English Civil War under Cromwell, led by Parliament, which of course represents that stratum, that social stratum of the burghers of the city. Then you get Restoration, the full-on attempt by the monarchy to become an absolute monarchy under a Catholic leader, after the model of France, evidently. And eventually you get the Glorious Revolution, which is a Powell Compromise in 1688, which is just good enough to last until today, where you have shared sovereignty between Parliament and King, but that's an arrangement that proves to be flexible and stable enough to be a formula for success. And then shortly after that, of course, you also get the incorporation of Scotland into the realm, which in itself requires another war against the Jacobites, descendants or rather supporters of the last king in the legitimate line of succession that was ended in the Glorious Revolution. Now, in Russia and Poland, Lithuania, this process of territorial state making is intertwined. And in many ways, it involves that whole borderland south of St. Petersburg, down the middle of the continent there, where in the late 1500s, but mostly in the 1600s, an attempt by Poland, Lithuania to conquer big parts of Muscovy, later on Russia, fails. And this then allows the Romanov dynasty, which will remain in power until 1917, to rise to power and establish territorial consolidation in Russia. Poland, Lithuania goes the opposite route. You have in that whole area that is the Pale of Settlement, where you have a Jewish population that has been living there since the 1300s, where they were refugees from pogroms in Western and Central Europe, and were taken in by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth on the assumption that we have all these depopulated lands. There were raids by Central Asian horsemen There were slave raids by the Muslims from the Black Sea. There has been the plague, of course, that struck this area. So you have all that land that is depopulated, which is then the foundation for the Jewish Pale of Settlement, which is the place where the bulk of the Holocaust takes place. The 6 million were largely from there that were killed. So Poland-Lithuania was a remarkably pluralistic entity. Catholic, Orthodox, Jewish, even in the Lithuanian part of the realm, paganism. Still to this day, Lithuanians are proud of their pagan traditions that are presumably unbroken from pre-Christian times. I mean, they never went through the Christian times in the first place. But in the time of troubles that ended fairly early and well for Russia, up until the 1640s, the eastern part of Poland-Lithuania was the site of just horrific, unprincipled, clan-like warfare, where towns, especially Jewish towns, were wiped off the map, not rarely by the descendants, now Christianized, of Central Asian horsemen who had settled in places and formed their own local governments there, who eventually also came under Russian dominion, but at this point were doing their own thing. So in the end, Poland never recovered. And therefore, in the 1700s, when Austria, Russia, and Prussia went and partitioned Poland and took it over, by 1800, it was no longer on the map. Poland had ceased to exist. And part of it was that there are many discussions in these cases where people talk all about institutions as if that had anything to do with it. It is much more fruitful to look at social, economic power. But if you want the institutional account, it is because the Polish Assembly of Nobles was apparently not getting anything done because they had the liberum veto, which is to say one member could block the entire proceedings. So you have exactly the thing that territorial, monarchical, dynastic consolidation is supposed to end. The ability of the local nobility to just mess things up and hamper the king in doing what's right for the realm. They also had an elective monarchy, so they put the Elector of Saxony in place, Augustus the Strong, who was not really all that interested in governing Poland and neglected that and more or less let it go to seed. So this is an example of how not to do it. Germany is another. The 30 Years' War, and already in the 1500s, of course, you have religious warfare, and early revolutionary activity by the peasantry in the Peasants' War, as well as the occasional Ottoman encroachment on Germany from the east, from the Balkans. So the attempt by the Habsburgs in Germany to consolidate and centralize power began in earnest under Maximilian in the early 1600s. Against that, you had a counter movement by most of the nobility of Germany under a Protestant leadership, so that when in 1618 there was an election, because of course the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation too is an elective monarchy. There were two competing candidates. If everything had been gone, if everything had gone by how it was supposed to be done constitutionally, Frederick of the Palatinate, a Calvinist, would have become emperor. That's why the Austrians went to war and won. By 1621, they had won the Battle of White Mountain, had purged the College of Electors in their favor, and had gotten their guy enthroned as Emperor of Germany. That then led to massive warfare that killed a third of the population by 1648, over 2/3 in certain places. So what ended the war was, in fact, to put the international system of states on a new foundation of sovereignty in its own right and for its own sake, where the nation, nationality, and even dynasty are not the primary foundations on which you recognize somebody else's right to govern. It's rather the right to govern, sovereignty, is rooted in the mere fact that this person has power in this place. And this becomes the virtue that the whole system is sworn to defend for each other. So you don't go after somebody else's land. If another prince does, you have a right and duty to defend the attacked party. If the people go and question the power of their ruler, everybody has a right and a duty to come to the assistance of that ruler to defend their sovereignty. The reason for that is, of course, that one of the major dividing factors up to that point and in that war had been about religion. So if you can't even agree on an ideological, on a spiritual foundation for dealing with each other, the one thing that surely you can agree on is the fact that you all have armies and can't wipe each other off the map completely. That point has been proven in the war. And if you keep trying, you might just, run the whole place into the ground. So the basis is we accept that we are in power, and that's that. And of course, that too gives these rulers a whole nother claim to bringing in line people in their own territories who might think otherwise, separatism and so forth. On that basis, then, for the most part, you get the bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century. And with the UK, with the Glorious Revolution included, again, as a half-hearted case. But in the United States, in France, and in Haiti, you have revolutions that are saying what these 18th century monarchies, these empires, are doing, how they're governing us, how they're justifying it, what they are imposing on us in the process is not just. There's nothing wrong with the wish to have a sovereign people or nation in a territory if it is lawful, if it is legitimate. But you have to fight for that. This existing system is not going to give that to you. So in the United States, to found a new nation was based on denying the divine/dynastic right of British kings and saying we want a republic. In other words, a state that is based on the assumption that the people are sovereign, that sovereignty, which is that mysterious essence of power and statehood, really rests with the people, and that the kings have only usurped it. They've taken it, they've claimed it for themselves, but they really don't have any right to it. The same thing in France, the same thing in Haiti. Ironically, and Haiti included as an example of where that didn't go as desired. And the Haitians in their revolution, which was very much a twin revolution to the French, failed in the sense that they were conquered, that they were invaded, betrayed, and eventually subdued by mostly the French, but also, since many people consider this as a slave rebellion, a threat to their own interests, by other European powers as well. So one of the big questions in this age of revolution is, of course, you're proclaiming universal rights. Who are these rights for? Abigail Adams asking her husband to remember the ladies as they draft the Declaration of Independence. So is it for women too? Her husband, John Adams, writing back and saying, of course not. Where would this stop? Who's next? Jews, Negroes, Indians, Catholics? This is obviously not going to be for everybody. Ironically, when he is president, they do recognize Haitian independence, but only to piss off Jefferson. Really, Haiti is the proof of concept where at the time people say, no, actually, this is not for Black people. So let's not get there. Let's not go there. And so the 19th century, it is very much a blot on the image of universalism, of the Enlightenment, that when it was called upon to make that decision, is it really universal, even if it costs you a lot of money, because these are your sugar plantations, then the answer is no, actually, we don't think it's that universal after all. The other question is if that calls into doubt the universality or universalism of the Enlightenment. Different question. But where these revolutions do succeed, they, in part by taking on the scientific and rational mindset of the Enlightenment, and in part by simply not having to deal with as many factors of resistance in society as their precursors, the nobles, the monarchs did, who had to pay attention to ancient traditional rights. Republics could simply reorder society in a way that truly, fully centralized the state and gave the central power a direct line of contact through the law and through taxation and conscription and whatnot to each individual citizen. And in that process, it created individual citizens to begin with. Before that, you have no direct relation as a French subject to your king, to the state that the king embodies. You're a peasant who works for the landlord. The landlord is part of a noble estate, but it is shielded from taxation for the biggest part by ancient and traditional custom. So that's the end of it. You might have some kind of mediated economic relation to an emerging world market where France is a player, but not really. For the most part, you're still really satisfying your needs on a local basis, at most regional. So after the revolution, the peasant has a direct relation to the state. The land he owns is subject to laws that are administered by the government, not by some local noble and or the church, based on laws that apply equally to everybody, not just this particular estate. And he owes taxes to the central government, and he owes military service, and he, of course, gets to vote in elections for the parliament. So in this way, whatever monarchies had wished to do for centralizing a people, for governing a people and centralizing the state, these bourgeois revolutions really managed to do. It was like the wildest dreams of monarchies come true. If we're thinking of bourgeois revolutions as, liberation, sure, from false claims to authority, you've all read Tom Paine, from spurious claims to traditional prerogative, where Tom Paine says, no, really, these kings came into power because at some point in the Dark Ages, they showed up with the weapons and said, it's a nice village you have here. Would be a shame if something happened to it. Looks like you need a king. It's going to cost you, but it's going to be worth your time. So, that's like the question of legitimacy is a different one. But the question of how power is organized, the republics are a whole lot more inventive and actually more thorough in asserting their power. Even in the age of revolution, there is already an appeal to the people, to the people newly formed as a state subject, as a sovereign entity. The children of the fatherland march to the tune of the Marseillaise to defend their political project, the Republic. You have a reference to the nation, to the people, to the citizens of this republic. So there's already the language that suggests here is something that unifies us all. in spite of what many differences we might have. However, nationalism as we know it, the bad kind, the ethnic kind, the ethno-cultural kind, tends to first be formulated by counter-revolutionary projects. So when you have reactionary forces mobilizing against a revolution, clergy, gentry, small-time local authority figures who fear losing power to big-time central national authority. These local reactionaries find that although their project is one of maintaining local control, independent from nationwide centralized meddling, in order to get that, they too have to organize on a nationwide scale and make an appeal that can ask the question of power on that scale of the nation. So when in Lyon and in the Vendée, these reactionaries rise up against the French Revolution, or when the Spanish peasantry rises up against French occupation, it is under the leadership of reactionaries that are nevertheless making an appeal to the people because they themselves no longer can raise an army. They don't have a king to defend them. So it has to be a grassroots effort. It has to be from the bottom up. And it has to make an appeal that says, we are united here in spite of all our differences against the foreign invader. It's us, the Spanish, against the French. Same in Germany, where the philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte rallies his philosophy students in Berlin with his collection of addresses to the German nation, lectures given at that newly founded university dedicated to Enlightenment, reason, and all that, saying it is about the fatherland, it is about blood and soil, it is about defending the true nature of Germany. It is rooted in tradition and custom and virtue and religion, and to defend that against the godless French who are interested in secularism, an abstract kind of equality, a mere civilization without culture, an atomized kind of society as opposed to the more deeply rooted community in Germany. So what you have to do now to defend our nation is to rise up against these occupiers, commit acts of sabotage, seek death in this fight, because in death you will truly become one with the universal and eternal. If you die for your nation, that is the highest form of martyrdom. Forget about, redemption by religious means. Eternity exists, perhaps through God, perhaps through religious means, but really you become eternal only in that you're contributing to your nation. And through the generations, your deeds will be remembered and felt by your descendants. So that is the true meaning of eternal. And Romanticism, as a broad movement in the arts, contributes to disseminating these ideas of a people rooted in a spiritual commonality that is tethered to the soil, to places, to communities, as opposed to the French Revolution, which is an export product, alien to this soil, and the universal values of democracy, lawful and rational government, self-determination, etc., are really alien to us. Those are not German values. They're French values. We don't want them. So that's what reaction is about. The attempt to put that genie back into the bottle. And of course, in the Napoleonic Wars, this succeeds. And after that, everything is rolled back. Everything except those laws that helped modernize economic relations and gave the bourgeois more power. But that's a different story. So in the end, you once again have no nation state in Central Europe, in Germany. nor in Italy. You still have your three main ones, England, France, and Spain. Although Spain is kind of on the downward slope at this point. So how do you achieve some sort of integration and consolidation of power, say in Germany, where this is really mostly playing out? Here, intellectuals develop national consciousness. It's a precondition to state making. You want to consolidate the people as a cultural entity first, and then you have leverage to make the state a nation. So this meshes nicely with the political interests and the economic interests of the bourgeoisie. The one thing, if they can't have political freedom, at least they want an integrated national market. So the Prussian-led customs union is that part of a nation-making project where the bourgeoisie is saying, this is good for business, we need this, and if we can get it by working within the reactionary confines of the Germanic Confederacy, where you have censorship, no parliaments, and so forth, so be it. And then some of the more inventive liberals will say, and this is a step in the right direction. Because if we have all that commerce going on, it's going to free people's minds, and it's going to lead them to demand a nation state. So it is actually a revolutionary act if we are doing just that part of a political program that makes us money. Trust us on this. And of course, this kind of nationalism still remains attractive to reactionaries because, especially as democracy and socialism appear on the political horizon as popular movements, where people start to have meetings, publish papers and leaflets, even take up arms for democracy and or socialism, nationalism becomes a useful way of having an alternate offer. If you want to become involved in your community and make a difference, become a nationalist so that you don't have to go down that road of socialism. So these two, what that leaves us with, after the end of that age of revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, is two different versions of nationalism. Described by Friedrich Meinecke in 1908 in his book Cosmopolitanism and Nationalism. I think it's been translated Weltbürgertum und Nationalstaat, where on the one hand, you have the state nation, which is based on belonging to a political entity defined by a founding document that lays out certain rights. So this would be the civic model of nationalism that we've seen in Habermas. We're saying we want a constitutional patriotism. We want people to feel German because they belong to a state that is based on individual rights, democracy, humanism, and so forth. That would be the French original model. You're a Frenchman because you're in favor of these political values of equality, brotherhood, and liberty. And as I mentioned before, that means it's an open-ended invitation. If you're Tom Paine and you're coming to France to join the revolution, you're a Frenchman. And if you're sitting in your local chateau, plotting with your peasants on how to bring the king back and end the revolution, doesn't matter if your family has lived in that part of France for 800 years, you are not a Frenchman, and you can leave. So that is the civic model, the state nation, distinct from the culture nation, which is based on the ethnic, cultural, linguistic, etc. model developed by Fichte. This is what we would call the blood and soil model of ethno-cultural nationalism. And in some cases, in most cases, you get like a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And few places at any given point of time are fully committed to one model or the other. France in the 1790s is clearly pure state nation. Germany in the 1930s is clearly culture nation, defined by the ethnicity and culture and so forth. But usually it's a mix. The United States leans clearly more towards the civic model ever since the post-Civil War amendments, especially the one that defines citizenship as something that is by birth. That is like the jus soli, the Latin principle of citizenship that goes with the state nation, the law of the soil, as opposed to the jus sanguinis, the law of the blood. That means you're a citizen because of your bloodline and not because you were born on the soil of the nation. I could go on about, because it is also relevant for the question of slavery, actually, both in England and then later on in the United States. To what extent is it possible to have free soil as opposed to laws that apply differently to different people and based on what criteria as to whether you can or cannot be a slave? And another theorist from the 19th century, Ferdinand Tönnies, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, community and society, goes with this because for him, describing how people feel about belonging in the place where they are, community is what goes with the ethnic model. Community is where you don't choose, but where you're born into, where you don't have to learn how to do things, but where it's understood, and where you are inherently linked, often in sort of hierarchical relations, usually in a way where you can mutually depend on each other, but where you're not independent for that reason. As opposed to society, which is really, when you look at the term, a free association where you can become a member and where you can also end your membership, where people are and remain, even as they join the society, individuals with their own separate individual interests. And they form a society, say, the New York Society for the Prevention of Pauperism and Crime, that then builds a poorhouse only for a specific and limited purpose. And when that purpose is done, they can go their own separate ways. So this is supposedly the model that goes with the civic state, and also, of course, with capital. So this leaves us with two main projects: a combination of community as the ideal of social relations combined with ethnic nationalism, or society and civic nationalism. In the aftermath of World War I, and even as, just like previously during the 30 Years' War, statesmen begin to think about a new, firm, and lasting basis for peace and an international system of states. When the League of Nations is formed to provide that kind of container for an international system that is peaceful, it is shaped by the ideas of Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson is very much somebody who thinks in terms of the ethnic nation state. He is the president that signs the Immigration Restriction Act into law, after for 20 years his predecessors all vetoed it. He is the president that screens in the White House the birth of a nation, that absolutely vile, racist justification for Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, and one of the greatest American motion pictures of all time, if you're just looking at the technical and artistic side of it. It's a powerful work of white supremacist propaganda. Woodrow Wilson says we want self-determination and democracy to be the basis for peace in the future. And who is the subject, the sovereign subject of self-determination? The people. And they are defined in an ethnic fashion. So to make peace, we're going to redraw the boundaries and make sure that the national borders are congruent with the area of settlement of these groups of people that are in the nation. That means you have to take apart the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires, and you have to found many, oftentimes very small, new nation states. In many cases, however, in most cases, I would even say, that means that you're dealing with large territories that are mixed. In Upper Silesia, for instance, you have Germans and Poles living as neighbors in all of Silesia, as a matter of fact, living as neighbors for hundreds of years. In northern Schleswig, which I think the Danes call southern Jylland, Danes and Germans have been living next to each other for years. In the Balkans, you have one village that is Muslim Bosniak and another village that is Orthodox Serb and another that is Croatian Catholic, all within shouting distance. And now we're going to have to redraw these boundaries to make sure that every ethno-linguistic group is living in a contiguous territory that is homogeneous. So this is an invitation for ethnic cleansing, displacement, and so forth. And there is a whole lot of that after the war. Those groups who are minorities within a new nation state are usually left vulnerable because clearly they're not part of the plan. And this applies to Jews in Germany definitely, because are Jews a people? Shouldn't they have a state where they live? And if not, what do they want here? Does it have to be our state where they live? So anybody who is not committed to the nation, who doesn't fit into this ethnically homogeneous plan, is suspicious. And if to play in the international system of states, you need to show that your state is based on national self-determination, you have every incentive to purge those that don't belong and to set your polity on the basis of national identification. That has, of course, a long history. Even the German Empire, which really was, the question is, was that a nation state if it's led by an emperor? Shouldn't it have to be based on self-determination to be counted? But I think that may be the wrong question. But to the extent that the German Empire under Bismarck mobilized nationalism to consolidate its power and authority, it did so by going after those who were not part of the main ethnic religious group. So anybody who wasn't like a German-speaking, ethnically German Protestant. Danes and Poles could be suspected of wanting their own state. Jews and Catholics belonged to religious groups that were not necessarily loyal to the nation. Socialists were sworn internationalists and didn't believe in the nation to begin with. So then also from 1918 in the other direction, when you look at the basis for German expansion under the Nazis, the basic claim for that was always to say we have to protect the rights of Germans. The Germans in foreign countries are being oppressed. They don't get to speak their language. They don't get to have their culture. They don't have access to jobs and opportunities. It's a human rights issue. So in Czechoslovakia and Poland, where strong German minorities remained after the redrawing of these boundaries, that became the opening for the Nazis to say, we should have that land because that's where the Germans are. But nothing is more suspicious to a nationalist. And in fact, nationalists of different nations and shades can come together and make common cause in opposition to and in fighting against internationalism. And it is really that group of people, communists, anarchists, any kind of proletarian internationalists that you find in these Western democracies or in more authoritarian nation states that become the most vulnerable and that become the universal enemy of the state. In many cases, they are also associated with other groups identified as alien and dangerous. So in Eastern Europe, where you have communists, and that also means people who want to be aligned with the Soviet Union, who would want their own nation not to be independent and governed by local reactionaries, but rather to be part of the Soviet Union, are often labeled as Jewish. Some of them are Jewish, and it is labeled as a Jewish project of internationalism. So you see how these things go well together, all the different enemies of the nation. Nationalism is a valuable tool for mobilizing the people, as we've seen since the Age of Revolution, against their liberation. Nationalism is also a great way of legitimizing the role and function of the nation state as the political container for organizing the global competition of capital, usually organized as national bourgeoisies. Although, of course, yes, we do have globally operating corporations and so forth, but that historically has been the dominant way, the nation state, the national bourgeoisie, of organizing that competition in an orderly fashion. So if you want to tell a group of people that they have to take a pay cut, what better way to do that than to say, if you don't, the Chinese will win, or your job will be sent to Mexico. So nationalism is a way of demanding that people identify with their national bourgeoisie vis-a-vis workers and the bourgeoisie of foreign countries is a standard trope. And when Mitt Romney in 2012 in the election often returned to this commonality of interest between capital and labor, this was a classical nationalist talking point. And all the disloyal elements that stand against the nation can be defined ultimately by their global scope. Not just the Jews, not just proletarian internationalists, but others as well. So you might have ultramontanism is like Catholics, people who believe in a leader who lives over the mountain from German perspective. Rome is south of the Alps. Freemasonry. Only one of these things is real. Obviously. Don't tell anybody I've seen it and know it. So no, actually, proletarian internationalism is a real thing. People believe in that, people want that, and see that as a positive alternative to the nation state, and act on that basis. And they're not working with any of these other groups. So that's nationalism. Any questions? Yes.
So proletarian internationalism, wouldn't that be similar to globalism?
No. Globalism, when people talk